everybody. Hi. So I'm really glad that you guys all came here. I'm really honored to have all of you come out for to this conference and also to this talk. Honestly, though, how many people are here just to get good seats for Sandy next session? Ha! That makes me the poor Comic-Con panel right before the Avengers or something like that, yeah. Anyway, I'm glad you're here. My name is Noel Rappin. I work for a small company called TableXI, a web consulting firm in Chicago. You can follow me on Twitter at NoelRapp. Thanks. Hi. So here's my problem. I want my users to have a rich client experience. You know, I work with clients, they come in, they say they want a rich client experience because it's something they read in Wired or Forbes or something like that. They don't really know what it means. They know that they want it. They know that it means that. They know that in part it involves having their users have an experience where the site is fast. It involves having a site that has graphical bells and whistles beyond what you would normally expect from a traditional web page. But beyond that, they don't really know what they want. And I, as an architect, as the person developing their site, want to deliver this to them in the most efficient, the best way possible, the one that gives them the best site long term. So imagine, if you will, that you have a commission like this and you're looking for advice on how to build this site, and you come here to RailsConf. And yesterday you sit and you see David Hansen say, if it's document-based, structure it like Basecamp. And he goes on to say that structuring it like Basecamp means these 5 things: key-based cache exploration, Russian down-nested caching, JavaScript decoration, turbolinks, polling, and so on. I'm going to assume, by the way, that everybody here either saw the keynotes yesterday and today or doesn't care about the technical details, and in both of those cases, you don't need me to tell you what turbolinks are. So we're gonna pass on that a little bit. So I don't know, is my application document-based? It's got documents, maybe. It's just, I don't know. So I come here the next day and I see Yehuda just an hour ago. Rails makes a great API for serving JSON to a browser, and the locus of innovation is in the client. And he suggests that you should build HTML in the browser using HTML. That's what I get for quick editing my talk in the slot between the last keynote and now. That you should avoid ad hoc JavaScript and avoid Backbone specifically, and you should stop hiding from JavaScript. The Rails community, or those of us that are trying to build sites like this, are at a fork in the road. Yes. So the question becomes: do we bear left? Do we right frog? Do we jump over the fork, try to sneak through the tines? Like, what is the best structure here? Because even with David and Yehuda saying these things, you still have me. I just want to build an e-commerce site. And I just don't want Keynote to crash. I just want to be able to write my e-commerce site. Okay. So not for nothing, but I've been writing HTML since about 1994 and 1995. I'd be surprised if there were more than 10 or 15 people in the room that could say that they've been doing it longer than I have. Not that that means anything in terms of this, except that I spent the years 1998, 1999, and 2000 largely telling clients to avoid JavaScript completely, even for things like pull-down menus, because it was such a huge pain in the ass to get it to work in the browsers at the time, which were IE4 and Netscape 4. So that's my old person cred. The last 4 apps that I've worked on or planned bounced out like this. There was a traditional Rails app that it was fairly small. I rewrote it in Backbone largely for the experience of writing it in Backbone, and then unrewrote it in Backbone because Backbone was annoying me. I have an application that's kind of a hybrid front-end JavaScript without really a framework. We'll talk a little bit more about that one later because I actually think it's interesting in this context. I have an Ember app that's Ember in part because it's interfacing with a JavaScript map API, so it needed to have a lot of stuff on the browser. And the application that I'm currently sort of trying to figure out what to do, which is currently built upon what you would call a traditional Rails CMS plus e-commerce application. And What I want to talk about here is how I made these decisions, how we decided that this application would be Rails, how I decided that this application would be Ember, what criteria are important. You know, it's one thing for Yehuda to say the future is in JavaScript, for DHH to say the future is in continuing to use Rails plus Turbolinks. We all have to develop things in the present. What criteria can we use to make this decision? So I present here a simplified schematic of a web application. It's got a user, and it's got data, and it's got stuff. By the way, the person is actually the XKCD, you're doing it wrong on the internet guy, who seemed appropriate. The user, essentially, this is true for both, no matter how the application is structured, the user is talking to the data effectively. The user is sending a request into the stuff. That stuff is talking to the database. It's taking that response and converting it into some sort of representation that can be displayed to the user. And that is a common structure. Yehuda was taking great pains this morning to talk about common structures and things that we agree on. We kind of split this into client stuff and server stuff. That some of these things happen on the user's machine, some of these things happen on the server, and regardless of document-based, which is a term that I'm not completely sure has a specific meaning, the schematic difference at this level between the way that DHH was talking and the way that Yehuda was talking breaks down something like this. Okay? In Basecamp, primarily your application lives in the server. You think of it as living in the server. That's why he can say things like have it add a sprinkle of JavaScript, because in the way that the application is structured, the heart of it is on the server. You know, in the same way that most people sort of intuitively think of themselves as being kind of right here between their eyes, Basecamp lives on the server. And the stuff on the client is only the things that you need to have happen to make it go on the client. Conversely, if you look at something like Discourse lives on the client, and the server only exists to support the heart of the application, which lives on the client. So when you think of, and the difference between that is sort of as simple and as profound as that. There's no technical reason why these things can't be done on the client or on the server, and there may not even be a technical reason why they shouldn't be done. It becomes a question of where you think the heart of your application is and why you come to choose one piece over the other. One of the things that makes this kind of fraught for the people in this room is that client-side stuff is written in JavaScript, and server-side stuff, again, for the people in this room, is written in Ruby. And most of us here like Ruby more than JavaScript. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be here. We would be at, I don't know, home, probably. And JavaScript's existence on the browser is maybe one of the most inexplicable historical accidents of the web in general. JavaScript has its charms, but the fact that it wound up as being like the primary language of the browser is a combination of timing and accidents and then inevitability. Someday my grandchildren will say, why is the sky blue? Where does the sun go when it sets? And why is there JavaScript? And I will be able to answer at most 2 of those questions. Rails has historically dealt with JavaScript by avoiding it. Until relatively recently, the primary way in which a Rails application dealt with JavaScript was to pretend it didn't exist. So many of the people here wrote RJS, which was an attempt to find the most important JavaScript things that you would do and try and write them in Ruby. And as Yehuda was saying this morning, for a long time, this was completely rational. JavaScript's tooling was horrible. You couldn't test it. There were horrible browser incompatibilities that were very hard to overcome. The libraries were not patching them over. There were utilities that were missing. It was not worth the effort at that point. However, over time, as we all know, JavaScript tooling has been improving dramatically, and it's been catching up on all of these fronts. Now we have test suites. They're not quite as good as the Ruby test suites, but they're pretty good. We have debuggers that are actually really good. There are libraries that do most of the things that we need. And so for a while, the standard Rails approach to JavaScript is not so much that we're avoiding JavaScript, but that we're avoiding complicated MVC structures. That we are somehow avoiding having an MVC structure in the browser that mimics potentially the MVC structure on the server. And there's two ways to look at this. One way is to think of this as potential duplication, that we're looking at something that is a parallel, that we have a browser, if you're using Backbone or Ember, you have things that are models using controllers that are parallel to the ones that you have on the server. Another way of looking at this is that they are fractal, that the view layer from what is from the server layer, what is from the server's perspective, a view layer, when you look at it from the client's perspective, breaks off to have its own model view controller structure. And in that, if you think about it that way, it feels much less like duplication. But there's still, especially with the JavaScript frameworks as they existed up until a year or 6 months ago, there's still a very real possibility of having to duplicate logic between your client and your server. So the question becomes, where's the heart of your application? Do you think of what you're doing as being primarily server-side interaction with data that incidentally gets displayed to a client? Or do you think of it as client-side interaction with a user that incidentally uses server data? And how can we make an informed decision for a new project? This was Nick Quanto tweeted this yesterday during DHH's keynote. This is your periodic reminder that there's more than one way to build a web app, and that's OK. So on some level, the stakes here are very low. Like, we can build a working web app for almost everything that we want to do. We can do in the Basecamp style structure, and we can also do it in the JavaScript style structure. But it's still kind of a fraught question, in part because the question is in a world that has Ember and Node, like, do we need Rails? And I don't want to belabor this point, except to say that to some extent, this is where some of the emotional heft of this question comes from for those of us, again, in this room who have, I think many of us have spent a fair amount of our professional careers working in Rails and have some stake in it continuing to be an ongoing ecosystem. I don't think that it's threatened here. I'm just pointing out that that's one of the issues that makes this compelling, or maybe a little bit more fraught than it might be. Anyway, if you are looking for proof that Rails still has a lot to offer, if you look at the Rails API project, which is basically Rails with the view stripped out, they have a very, very long list of things that Rails still provides that you would need to do one way or another in a server-side application, even if you didn't use Rails. And this is still a lot of stuff. So I think that one of the reasons for the disconnect between the Basecamp team and the Ember team both saying that their way is the easiest way to go, the simplest way to go, is in some ways, an argument about complexity and what complexity is in a computer system and how you deal with it. I have a unified theory of complexity, which is that you can make things more complex than they are, but you cannot make things less complex than they are. At some point, complexity is just part of your application. If you're writing a tax program, like, it's just not going to be a simple structure, no matter what tool you bring to bear on it. The question becomes, how can you manage it? And there are a couple of different approaches. One approach, which is associated, I think, primarily with object-oriented programming, suggests that simplicity, the lack of complexity, comes when you can deal with components separately. If I can talk about my client without worrying about my server, that makes it easier to deal with my client. If I can talk about my server without worrying about my client, That makes it easier to talk about my server. And inside all of those pieces, if I can talk about users without caring about products, that allows me to focus. Okay. But that's not the only definition of simplicity in use in programming. There's also a definition that's a little bit more associated with functional programming, which comes from the idea that simplicity is using simple structures. Those of you who were at this conference last year may have heard Rich Hickey give a keynote talk called Simplicity Made Easy. And this is the kind of simplicity that Rich Hickey was talking about. He was talking about simplicity where you use simple data structures, pretty much just lists and hashes, and instead of isolating the data, basically what you're isolating is the steps. I can think about this step without worrying about anything else that I'm doing in any of my other steps, and that makes my application simple to deal with, right? Everything here is about how we deal with it. A lot of dealing with complicated programs is trying to figure out a way to lower your cognitive load and lower the amount of things you need to keep track of at one time. This structure is a step-by-step way of doing it. So I would submit that for the most part, the Ember, the client-side approach, is dealing with this definition of simplicity. We're willing to put up with extra structure on the client side for the ability to have a clean, simple handoff between what I consider client and what I consider server so that I can think about the two of those things separately. And I submit that the Basecamp structure here is more in line with this definition of simplicity. I don't want the extra structures. I don't care even that my JavaScript may look ad hoc to you because it doesn't have these structures. What's important to me is that every individual step in this transformation between data and my final display, each individual step is simple and comprehensible to me. These are both valid ways of looking at the problem, but I think many of us sort of inherently, in the way that we think about programming, will gravitate towards one or the other. I tend to gravitate more towards this definition of simplicity. But that's probably just something in my head as opposed to a statement that one of these is better than the other. You can also argue that simplicity is just consistency, that just the act of dealing between components in a consistent way or having an API that is consistent is simpler. The Basecamp approach uses simpler JavaScript structures. It doesn't build up these kind of complex hierarchy of tools on the JavaScript side, but the trade-off is that it is dealing between the server and the client in at least 3 distinct modes. And this, I don't think I'm making this up. I think this was pretty much directly acknowledged yesterday. The server side in Basecamp can send HTML. Sometimes it sends JavaScript. Sometimes it sends JSON. So again, you're trading one kind of simplicity for one kind of complexity. On the client side, you generally have going back and forth using JSON, a kind of simplicity. At the same time, sometimes you may need to have complexity both in terms of the structure, the added structure that you need on the client, and then also the fact that you may need, under certain circumstances, to duplicate logic in both places. As Yehuda pointed out, it's not clear that one side or the other requires less code, right? That's a very fast and dirty metric or simplicity for us. How much code do I need to write? Yehuda was pointing, the 950 thing that Yehuda pointed out came out of sort of a just very quick and dirty look that Tom Dale, one of the Ember core members, did. He went through and looked at Basecamp and Discourse and a Backbone application, which I forget, and a couple of other things, and just check to see how much, what their pure JavaScript load was. And they're all fairly similar. And obviously, we're not comparing apples and oranges, and possibly not even apples and other fruit. But there doesn't seem to be any systemic reason why one of these approaches is more complex in the sense that it needs more code. And I think that's especially true if you're using CoffeeScript instead of JavaScript and simplifying your code there a little bit. Now, another possible decision point here is speed. Both of these approaches claim speed. Speed has always been a Major feature of Basecamp's marketing, that it's the fastest web application going. Speed was also a factor in Discourse's initial argument that it was very fast for a web application. But there's something interesting about the way that these applications interact with the server that I think points toward a way that you can think about deciding which is right for your project. And so I'm assuming here, which may or may not be true, but I'm assuming here that the bottleneck in terms of lag, in terms of the application, is the lag in terms of getting to the server, getting a server response. And that by and large, the actual content of the server response is not the lag here. If you're working in a Basecamp structure, the number of times that you go to the server is essentially proportional to the number of user interactions. If you think about the way that David was talking about the caching and all of that stuff, in Basecamp, almost any time a user clicks on something, you're going back to the server to get the HTML for the next step. In Discourse, potentially you are not. In a client-side structure, you have an increased ability because you have a lot of data and a lot of interaction logic already there on the client. You only need to go to the server when you need new data. And a lot of times, you actually don't need to go to the server to update things. You can just update things on the client first and then notify the server, which is better in terms of the perceived speed from the user's perspective. So one of the things that makes that true is that, at least in theory, and at least one person with a blog post that I could not find, suggested that Basecamp's speed advantage goes away over a slow connection, like in a hotel conference Wi-Fi situation, or mobile. Because Basecamp's goal is to make that round trip to the server as fast as possible, whereas in a client-side app, you are minimizing the number of times you need to make that round trip in the first place. And the extent to which you can conceive of your application as something that doesn't need to go back to the server every time the user clicks something, the more compelling the client-side structure is. I tried to finish the sentence in my head. For each of these architectures, the sentence, this architecture is optimized for what? Like if I put this in place in terms of my entire team, my system, what am I trying to make fast? And I don't know whether DHH or Yehuda would agree with these sentiments. I also think one of the most dangerous things you can do is to try and paraphrase the arguments of people who are smarter than you. But here's what I came up with. The server style is optimized to be least disruptive to what has come across as the Rails style of programming. I don't think that the Basecamp team puts it together in those terms. They obviously did Basecamp Next as a complete rewrite. But it is in practice a decoration and an augmentation of the way Rails works. If you know how Rails works, you can get fairly significant speed up in your user responsiveness relatively easily. Turn on turbolinks, put in this cache key stuff, and your Rails application becomes significantly faster without a whole lot of extra work. I think that there are a couple of ways to think about this on the client side, but I think that the client side, one of the ways to think about this is optimized to have the server logic be as simple as possible, on the theory that the server is the shared resource, and that the extent that we can minimize usage of that shared resource, our whole system application is better off. Okay. So I really did go back and look at those 4 applications that I put up at the beginning, and I started to think about why we had decided to do them in the architectures that we had chosen. In some cases, I was guessing because I wasn't involved in that. But I was trying to tease apart what made these things suitable for what we chose, or whether we had even chosen the right direction. And some of the questions that I was thinking about asking, so I have a new project, and I'm trying to decide whether to write it like Basecamp or write it like Discourse. One of the things to think about is the representation of the data stable? Not the data itself, but how the data is represented to the user, is that stable? Do all the users see basically the same thing over time? One of the things that I think was clear from the keynote yesterday was that Basecamp structure gets complicated to the extent that different users see different things because it interferes with the caching. So in, for instance, my Ember application, which is a map application that where time changes, the representation of the data is not stable. It changes over time. We have it's an internal simulation. The data continually changes in a way that would be fairly hard to capture from a server side. On the other hand, the traditional application that I saw, large chunks of the screen are the same for everybody who looks at it. And that's amenable to caching, and therefore probably might have been a case where a Basecamp TurboLinks cache structure would have been more valuable to me. Can I think of the client's interaction with the server as primarily being one of notification? If you think about a to-do list application, if I check a to-do list and all the data is already there on the client, I can update that to-do list first and then only go back to the server to tell the server that the to-do list that this to-do item has been checked at the end. I'm notifying the server that something happened. I'm not asking the server's permission because in a client-side application, the logic lives on the client. Okay. Now, that doesn't work for all things. You know, if you're talking about a blogging engine, perhaps, a lot of times when you are entering something within a form, you actually are changing data. You actually need new data. You need an updated homepage. If you think about something like Wikipedia, if I click on a link in Wikipedia, I'm not notifying the server that something happened. I actually need new data from the server. That implies to me that that would be a poor choice for a client-side application. And to some extent, I'm trying to tease out black and white in what is obviously a shade of gray world. But these are the kinds of things that I think that would be helpful for you to ask about. Another question is, do the client components interact? One of the things that specifically drew us to Ember for this map application is that there are all kinds of things that happen in relation to each other on the client. I click on something on the map and information pops up about it, and that information needs to dynamically change as the simulation clicks forward. Ember is really, really good at capturing that kind of change, to have things happen on your page automatically when data changes in a way that would be very hard to replicate on the client. So to the extent that you can look at your application and say, this is something that happens on the client in reaction to something else that happens on the client, then you're looking at trying to build in terms of one of the MVC frameworks. Okay. Also, what do you already have? Like, you don't get style points for picking a hard choice. Like, you need to actually build something. If you have programmers that don't know JavaScript, it is probably a bad idea to teach them all JavaScript while you're trying to learn a new project. I think at most, you try and do one new thing on a project. We picked Ember for this map application. None of us really knew Ember tremendously well, but one of the reasons we picked it was because of the nature of it. It was fairly low stakes. If Ember didn't work out and we lost a couple weeks to trying to figure Ember out, it was fine for various reasons that I don't really need to go into, but we were in a situation where we could experiment. The application that I'm specifying now, first of all, already has a Rails application that's partially been built that we're talking about maybe using, and it's also on a very tight time horizon. I don't have a chance there to experiment, and I'm probably not going to try and pick Angular just because I think Angular is cool, although I do kind of think Angular is cool. So perspective, understand what you have. This doesn't mean never learn or never do the right thing. It does mean that a component of doing the right thing is your context. Like, what do my people know? What can I teach them? What is the consequence of making a wrong choice here? And I think it's also worth looking at hybrid approaches. Basecamp uses Backbone for part of it. My application that I mentioned is a hybrid, is a kind of a portfolio application. it is primarily does client-server interaction through JSON, but it doesn't use a framework on the client side because the JavaScript display on the client side is actually fairly straightforward. What we actually are doing there is we're using the active model serializer gem to do a lot of processing of the data server side and sending that over as JSON client side. So it's relatively simple. We're using templating tools on the client side, but we don't need a framework because the templates are relatively straightforward. We don't have a lot of business logic. And that approach actually worked out very well. It doesn't quite fit neatly into either case. We actually do have server-side logic, but that server-side logic is pushing towards not sending HTML to the client, but sending JSON to the client, and the client puts that stuff together. And I think that, try to look at places where for your application, you can get the best of both worlds. In this case, we were able to get better interactivity and pull things off the client, and yet we were still able to do server-side processing in things that the client doesn't need to know about. So we were still able to enforce that separation between the client and the server, even while not going all the way towards a JavaScript framework. Okay. All right, just a couple of other points. At this point in 2013, there is no excuse to be re-downloading assets. This is the same way I would have said in 2008 that there is no excuse to not page cache things that can be page cached. 95% of you are going to ignore this. I will probably ignore it. Still, in 2013, there's no excuse to re-request assets. Either you should be using a single-page JavaScript application or turbolinks or some other structure where you do not have to continually request all of this stuff. It seems to me like we are heading to the point where that is a solved problem. I think that this conversation will be different in a year. I think that I would have said that last year and the year before and the year before that. But I think that this is really true. Like, I have been using Ember. I've been writing about Ember. I really like Ember. I think it's very powerful. I think it's going to be, in a year, once 500, 1,000 people have built web applications on it and smoothed off the rough edges, I think it's going to be great. I think that these JavaScript tools are getting better very rapidly, and that even if you looked at Ember in November, like 6 months ago, it has changed dramatically even in those 6 months and in ways that really have improved the experience of putting together an Ember application. I can't speak to the others as well, but as much, but these tools are continuing to get better, and I think that what's going to happen over time is that the Basecamp approach, there seems to me to be a sort of island of applications that really respond to the Basecamp approach. Things that look like documents, for lack of a better term, things that are easily cacheable on the server, things that don't have a whole lot of client interaction. I think that there's still an island where that's better. But I think that as the JavaScript frameworks get more and more powerful, I think that island is going to get smaller and smaller. And I think that these tools will become more and more important, and that the applications that you may use will be more amenable to them. So, I don't know whether that qualifies as a dramatic conclusion or not. I am out of slides. So, I appreciate your time. I do have a couple of things that I want to just mention. I work at TableXI in Chicago. You can follow us at tablexi.com. I do a weekly, more or less, screencast, 5 to 10 minutes lightning talk series called XI to I, which you can get at that URL. Sometimes it's technical, sometimes it's project terms. I'm really happy with how it's turned out, and I hope you guys will check it out. Also, my coworker Greg has a site which is actually currently just a discourse board. It's called devpress.com. It's for dealing with clinical depression in the development community and ADHD and various other mental disorders that disproportionately affect developers. If you're interested in that, please take a look and join that community at devpress.com. He's just getting started with it. As for me, you can follow me online at Noel Rappin, again on Twitter at Noel Rapp. I have a book, Master Space and Time with JavaScript. If you are looking to embrace your JavaScript and get better at it, I somewhat self-servingly recommend this. It talks about testing in JavaScript, it talks about the JavaScript object model, and it also talks about Backbone and Ember. It's available at noelrappin.com. Through Friday, you can get 25% off with RailsConf 25. And that's it for me. We have a couple minutes for questions if a couple people have questions. Thank you for your time and attention.